Hello, welcome to the March 2023 issue of IGIE. My name is Phillip G. from the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, section editor for historical considerations. Procedural fields are well known for devices that are named after their original inventors, from Kelly clamps and Bookwalter retractors in surgery to the Amplatz guide wire in interventional radiology. While several such devices do exist in gastroenterology as well, arguably none are more famous and more universal than the Roth Net. In everyday gastroenterology practice, the term Roth Net is essentially used to describe retrieval nets made by any manufacturer, making the humble yet venerable retrieval net perhaps the single most famous endoscopic device in mainstream gastroenterology practice. Simple yet elegant in its concept, the advent of the Roth Net embodies the spirit of innovation in gastrointestinal endoscopy. We are therefore honored and delighted to have the opportunity to interview Bennett Roth as our distinguished guest for Historical Considerations section for IGIE for the March 2023 issue. Dr. Roth is arguably one of the original endoscopists and innovators in our field. Besides the retrieval net that he invented in 1983, Dr. Roth has taught the rest of us what it means to be an all-around gastroenterologist. Over a long career in both academic and private practice, Dr. Roth embodies the spirit of lifelong learning as a passionate gastroenterologist who is simultaneously a master generalist, specialist, and endoscopist. Dr. Roth has served in numerous high-profile administrative roles, including as clinical chief of the UCLA Division of Digestive Diseases, as well as president of the ASGE in 1994 to 1995. Even in retirement, he has continued to mentor junior faculty while keeping up with developments and advances in the field that he very much deeply loved and profoundly impacted. Dr. Roth, thank you so much for taking the time to provide this interview. It's truly an honor and privilege. You've been a pioneer for most of your career, partially because you have a pioneering spirit, and partially because, quite frankly, you did not have much of a choice as you joined a field that was still in its infancy. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Tell us a little bit about the field of GI when you started your training.
Thanks so much, Phil, for your kind introduction, and very much appreciated, and I'm sure a bit excessive. I really didn't think about it as much until we started this process, and I realized how much has changed over the years and how sophisticated we've come from the very basic beginnings of endoscopy as it was when I started doing it. It's a dramatically different playground now with dramatically different tools and abilities to do things that we never dreamed we could.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a completely different world, and actually, I remember you telling the story of how obstructive jaundice used to be diagnosed, and the stories of how colonic polyps used to be managed back in the 1970s.
Yes, totally different. As we've talked about before, we had very little ability to handle resected polyps, and once we cut them from their attachments to the colonic wall, we then had to retrieve them, and you could suction the polyp up onto the face of the scope. But of course, that gave you a readout, and you couldn't see anything, and you just had to hope that you still had it in tow as you pulled the scope out. And of course, that precluded you from being able to see if there were any additional polyp structures along the way of retrieval. So you had to put the scope back in, and for every time you took out a good-sized polyp, that's pretty much how you did it, and reinserted and reinserted. At times we would take a snare for a good-sized polyp and grasp it. The problem there was related to the fact that if you squeeze too hard, of course, you'd run the risk of bisecting the polyp and then having to take out two pieces of polyp. If you succeeded with a good-sized polyp in tow with a snare, once you got to the rectal sphincter, if there was some tightness there or squeezing, You might have some difficulty pulling the polyp out without dislodging it or tearing it or whatever, and you'd lose the reliability of the histologic interpretation and things of that nature. So it became a real issue. Small polyps we would just suction up into a canister and throw them in some formalin and submit them. We didn't have the control that we needed. But nothing really happened for the first several years of colonoscopy. One day I was watching some TV show, and it was an outdoorsman type show, and whatever, and they scooped a fish out of the lake with a nice big net. It cinched itself once they grabbed the fish, and dawned on me that that's really what we were looking for. So I drew a picture of what I had in mind, and it was sort of mimicked in its visual appearance as a regular snare. The difference being that instead of a hollow wire loop, it had some sort of a bag or net or means by which we could actually capture a polyp. I didn't know what to do with the idea at that point. I had a buddy who had been involved with several medical interventions, and he gave me the name of a guy who had a small medical device production company, Marlin Yunker, and they were located in Ohio. And I sent him a note and spoke to him on the phone, and he asked me to send him a drawing of what my concept was. And he thought it was a great idea, but the issue was how do you make it? What materials do you use, and how do you make sure it's going to work and it's safe and it's going to be reliable and so forth. And so he spent some time trying a variety of different materials and processes, etc. And he said he couldn't do it. It kept tearing, it kept falling off. He was using sort of a soft plastic netting that wouldn't stick reliably to the wire snare, and it just wasn't working. So I figured, good idea, but we aren't going to go anywhere with it.
And as I understand it, this happened in approximately the early 80s. I believe it was 1983 when the idea first came about.
Correct. And it sort of was taken off the burner for a while. And I was giving a talk at the OR nurses meeting in Long Beach. And I had to walk through the exhibit area to get to the auditorium. And I went by a booth, and there was Marlin. He was actually, at that point, had sold his original company to a larger outfit and had to have a pause in his business career as part of the agreement. And this was about maybe a year and a half, 2 years later, maybe 85 or so. And he was now selling a device to take the gallbladder out at the time of laparoscopic cholecystectomy, which had just come into play. And he had a rubber sac that he attached in some fashion to a loop that was able to be cinched a little bit to close the opening, and was using that to grasp the gallbladder and its contents, so there wouldn't be biliary spillage or loss of the stones in the abdomen as it was taken out. And I walked over, we connected, and I said, this is really the concept that we were talking about. And he said, you're right, it never dawned on me. But we didn't plan on using a rubber sac of any sort. let's see what else we can use. We were thinking, and I said, a net is what we need, just like they do for fish or for butterflies. And there was a fellow named Dean Seacrest who worked for his company, and Dean was a sort of a innovator kind of a guy, and was an engineering guy at heart. And he went out and went to some bridal stores, and he got netting, and brought that back. And they took the actual snare and fed it over and under the netting until they covered the loop itself, and attached that to the catheter, and essentially had a snare catheter that they converted into a net-like device. And it worked. It was simply tied, and then a knot was made at the end. And Marlin sent, I think he actually came out with a bag full of them that were prototypes, different sizes and slightly different design. And we played with a bunch of foreign body, marbles and pills and things like that, batteries, and seemed to be able to grasp it ex vivo. And so the next day, I was doing cases, and I took a few polyps off, and I used the snare. I mean the net to retrieve them, and it worked. And so he said, "Give me some time to go back and do the proper paperwork so we can get an approval from the FDA." And we did, and started using it.
And lo and behold, that was the birth of the Roth Net.
And that was it.
And so give me a sense as to approximately what year was that when they finally got everything put through the paperwork and the FDA approval?
I want to say it was around 1986, something like that,
Mm-hmm.
before the first actual nets became available.
Mm-hmm.
And a patent was applied for, I think, but it was a little bit later, and it took a while until that.
Yeah. I believe the U.S. endoscopy patent is from 1993, so approximately a full 10 years to have gone from an idea from a television show, which probably arose from frustrations from earlier in the day,
Right.
And to take it all the way through prototyping, testing, FDA approval, and patenting to approximately 10 years.
Yeah, exactly. But it was interesting that it was on the market, and there was no one else at the time who expressed much interest in. I didn't see any copies or any competitive products out there. I don't think people initially, at least the industry, didn't have that much of an interest in that sort of a device, which is fine with me.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see the difference in time, right? Such a thing would be unfathomable today, to not patent and protect your idea immediately to
Yeah.
prevent this type of thing from happening.
Right.
And so I guess, I might as well just ask you, besides having the idea, were you savvy at the time to kind of think about how to protect the idea and make sure that you got proper credit? And I guess, speaking of which, along the same lines, what did you get in return for your idea?
Well, I think a lot of that kind of discussion is so dependent upon the people you're working with. This was a one-man owned, family-owned business that they had at U.S. Endoscopy. They're the nicest straight shooters you'd ever meet in your life. And I never felt as though I was going to be taken advantage of in any way. I didn't know anything about what was needed to go about the business of getting a patent and all that. I was very naive. I was a doctor, what do I know from this stuff? And they, on the other hand, were very savvy, but they wanted to see if the market was there to warrant the expense and the workload that was involved in getting the patent and getting it produced and revving up, because it was time consuming. These are all handmade, and it would take, maybe 20 minutes or more at times to make a single snare, a single net. And so there was a hesitancy along the way, and it was only when people started using it and it got some publicity, and as a result, they moved ahead full blast. But it took time. It takes time with these things.
Yeah, and I think
I
that
felt very secure that whatever return I got was fair.
Yeah, and I think you make a very important point, which is, so often we think that as the physician, if you come up with an idea, you basically invent the idea and it all completely belongs to you. But I think you bring up a very different element to this, which is the ideas of how much goes into the actual manufacturing, right? And how much goes into the actual development of taking this idea from a TV show to an idea in your mind, to a drawing, to a prototype, and then the big black box of manufacturing and how
Yes.
that goes from a sheet of paper and a drawing to an actual product that when they put it in your hand is reliable and it performs and it's consistent too, right? And so my understanding, by the way, is that the rumor has it that the Roth Net today is still handmade. Is that true?
Yes, that's true.
That's amazing.
About 15 years ago, U.S. Endoscopy, this is when the net was going full blast in terms of production, and there were a variety of different models and different shapes and sizes and so forth. Excuse me. And as a result, they tried to find a more efficient way of making these nets, and they invested quite heavily in two machines that were making the nets. I think each one of the machines was like $300,000 or something like that, and found that the nets didn't come out as reliably with a very expensive non-man-made technique, and they had a lot of nets that failed or tore or what have you with the machine. So they went back to making them by hand, and now they have 3 full 8-hour shifts making nets by hand.
Made in the USA.
Made in the USA, absolutely right.
It's amazing. No, it's absolutely amazing that to think that even in this day and age, sometimes handmade is still better. And so, is it
Right.
still basically the concept is still a snare, and these people who these hardworking people who work 24 hours a day and 3 shifts, they still basically string the bridle netting into
Right
the
over
snare
the snare, exactly.
and tie a
And
little knot at the end.
then tie knots at different spots to prevent the netting from slipping as you're pulling or pushing, or as you're opening and closing it. And we realized that at the beginning that we had to take some special precautions and invent procedurally the way in which the net was manufactured to prevent slippage of the netting, to prevent the netting pulling off the wire, to prevent the wire itself from not reliably expanding the full amount each time. Once you got it wet, once you got it twisted, what would happen? The wire would initially not open fully or open as reliably. So we had to go through all of the growing pains of developing a product that was effective and reliable. It was the reliability and the ability to use the net repeatedly in any given case, because you didn't want to have to take a new net every time you were going to try to grab something. And it was strictly at the beginning polyps we were talking about, and then it evolved into the need for a net-like device to be used for removing foreign bodies, ingested foreign bodies. And I remember an interesting event with the use of the net for removal of foreign bodies, and that was Red Ginsburg. Was a fellow at Penn at the time, and I got a call from one of the folks at U.S. Endoscopy that Greg wanted to try the net for removal of some foreign bodies, so he could, do a paper on it and see what his experience and those around him might have been for removal of foreign bodies with the net. And I said, sure, go ahead. I had no objection to it. And he did. He wrote a paper with the success rates and so forth. And it sort of got some traction in that regard. And more people were starting to use it, sometimes inappropriately. I mean, for sharp razor blade type things, it's not the best because the blade will potentially tear the netting. But we used it in everything. We found that for certain objects, there was preference for the net over any other options, and it became very popular as something that we have in our armamentarium for removal of foreign bodies or food impactions and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Depending on what you specialize in, GI nowadays. The Roth Net evokes different images in your mind, right? I think for certain general gastroenterologists, when you mention Roth Net, what immediately comes to mind is foreign body retrieval. And whereas for those of us who have made a living out of endoscopic resections, the term Roth Net immediately evokes images of polyp retrieval. So right. It's very interesting to know the history that this was originally made for polyp retrieval, and then slowly over successive iterations, also found a very valuable niche in foreign body retrieval. Right. So, right. All of this obviously took a lot of time. You guys figured out, it took about 10 years to go from idea to patent, and even then, I believe the Roth Net has undergone multiple successive stages in evolution as well. Tell us a little bit about how the design of the net has changed over the years.
Well, the original net was an oval device with a wire that had certain degree of stiffness to it, and it was fine for for removal of polyps where the lumen was good size, and you can maneuver and grab a large piece of the polyp, if not the entire polyp, with a single grasp. Excuse me. The use of these nets with foreign bodies in a tight esophagus or with large food impactions, we found that the wire it would, when you opened and closed, it opened and closed and grasped and ungrasped, the wire would lose its shape and its reliability. So we had a meeting and decided we were going to make some changes for nets, especially those that were going to be used for foreign body retrieval or food impaction retrieval. And in so doing, we came up with the idea of a hexagonal snare wire that had corners built into it, and it kept its shape that way. When you opened it, it opened, and when you closed it, you could control the closure rate. And then when reopening it, it would assume it's a proper shape. And so we changed that, and we changed the way we sutured the netting onto the wire as well, to keep it firmly in place and not have it slide and lose some of the grasping ability. And we then decided we needed some nets that were bigger and some nets that were smaller and some that were round and some that were oval. And it would provide for a choice of device that was best suited to the procedure that you were doing at that particular moment. So there was, half a dozen different designs and shapes and materials at times that were developed.
Yeah, and I believe the current U.S. endoscopy portfolio includes 6 or 7 different
Yes.
designs for the
Right.
Roth Net, corresponding to all the different indications that
Right.
you described. And it's very
We even
interesting.
have we Yeah, we even have two types of netting
Mhm.
that can be used. One is with larger openings than the other for to enhance your visualization as to whether you're taking out foreign body or a polyp.
Very interesting. So even different netting designs, different sizes, like you mentioned, of the net itself,
Right.
of the weave as well. I'm definitely going to go back to the endoscopy unit after this and look and see what we carry, because I think for most of the viewership, uh, people may not realize that there are so many different editions. I think we're also accustomed to just asking for a Roth Net and expecting a Roth Net, and not realizing that there are so many nuances to it and so many different versions for different indications that you're using. I think this is, quite frankly, I think this interview will prompt a lot of people to go dig through their endoscopy units and their closets and
Right.
see what they actually have.
Yeah, I don't know that you need to have six different
Right.
varieties, but it's not uncommon to have two or three, and or a couple different sizes, depending upon what you're taking out. If you're taking out a large polyp and you want to preserve its anatomy, sometimes you need a bigger net, like they said, you need a bigger boat, jaws.
Right. Very good. So, I guess in reflecting back and thinking about your experience with innovation, what advice do you have for people in this day and age who have an innovation or an idea that they're seeking to develop?
The key thing is trust. You want to deal with people who you feel comfortable are going to support you and be honest with you and be fair with you. And it's your job to sell a company on the concept that you've come up with. Provide them with a rationale for why this device or material or what have you is of use and is practical. I mean, we came up with a device that took out polyps without you having to get out of bed. That would be great, but it would be probably $1 million worth of equipment that you'd have to use for each case. Well, I think that's of
Right.
course not going to happen. And so you've got to be practical about your device and decide whether it's something that is usable, affordable, and reliable. Once you come up with that, then you are going to speak to somebody from one of the companies that manufacture these devices. Tell them what your idea is. Have them sign a non-disclosure agreement so that they can't steal it from you without subjecting themselves to legal ramifications, and see if it can be produced. They probably will, if it's a viable product, they'll probably make some and try it out with a few select docs around the country who maybe they've worked with, maybe you've worked with, or both, and see to what extent that product has value and it can be manufactured and used in a reasonable fashion. At that point, if you find the answers to those questions are yes, yes, and yes, yeah, go ahead and start to produce it. And you usually, from a financial standpoint, will get most commonly a royalty type setup based upon sales or profits. It can be done any way you want that you can work out with the attorneys. But
And I think that also depends a little bit on what sort of institution you're working for. And I believe at the time that you came up with the Roth Net, you just so happened to have been in private practice for a
right,
very long time.
right. Yeah, I mean, different institutions have different rules with regard to intellectual property. If you are working in a university setting and you come up with a product, uh, you may have access or full rights to the profits, or you may have zero, depending upon what your institution does and what sort of rules they abide by with regard to inventions and new ideas and new approaches. Um, you're certainly going to do better if you don't have a partner in the equation that's going to siphon off some of the profits.
Right, right. At the same time, I think one of the central themes in terms of your experience with innovation, and one of the central themes I think in your career in general has been that of people and that of trust, right? I think working with people that you trusted, people like Marlon Yonker and US Endoscopy with the Roth Net, and I think, quite frankly, for the lack of a better term, I've always considered you to be a people person. And I think you probably, I think there's probably some truth to that. And, with that, we'll kind of segue a little bit into talking about being a people person. So um, you've held a number of administrative roles in your career. The most famous of which was president of the ASGE from 1994 to 1995. Tell us a little bit about being an administrator, and I think for those of us who are unfamiliar to that concept, how did you learn to develop those types of skills? Was being an administrator something you've enjoyed, or was it something that you developed and something that you learned to enjoy? And I suspect that again, going back to themes of trust and being a people person, I have a feeling this is something where you probably had a really good mentor along the way.
Yeah, I don't think you start out with the notion I'm going to do something or I'm going to emulate somebody because I want to become an administrator or go into the politics of medicine or the politics of practice and so forth. I think you get involved initially by interacting with those who are your colleagues or your peers, those whom you're providing services for, the patients, and those whom you need to please to get what you want to do medically and educationally and lifestyle wise to enhance your own life situation and professional situation. You don't go out with the notion that I'm going to spend the next 2 years learning how to be an administrator because I want to be the ASGE president.
Right.
It doesn't happen that way. You get on a committee because someone thinks you know enough provide some positive value to that committee. You serve to the best of your ability. If you, I guess if you do a decent job, somebody on that committee will point you out to somebody else who will say, well, you should be on this committee, or maybe do this, or would you like to be a counselor, or would you like to do this? And it evolves based upon your own interests, your own innate abilities to relate and to communicate. And most importantly, I think it's to be fair. Whether I was playing Little League Baseball or I was president of ASGE, the uppermost thing in my mind was to treat people fairly, be open to the advice and abilities of others. And, you know, Andy Rooney had a great line years ago when they asked him, what does it take to be successful in life? And he said, I always surrounded myself with people who were smarter than me, and figured I can't go wrong. And I live by that credo too. I really think if you have people who you trust, who you respect and admire, and you say, well, what would they do? What do they think? Or ask them what they think, and use their advice. And in so doing, I think you'll be true to yourself and provide people with a very reasonable way of dealing with things. If you do so, then I think that's what a good administrator does. You have a goal, and you have a process, and you attempt to provide the service that you've been asked to provide in the best way you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess along the way to becoming ASG president, or during your presidency, who were the people that you, I guess, held in trust and confidence, who kind of mentored and guided you along the way to getting there and succeeding?
The first answer I always give to those kinds of questions is, you know, my dad was that kind of a guy, and he was a very bright man, but was a product of the Depression, did not have the opportunity to go to college because of that. And he made his way in the world by being a hardworking, honest, straight shooter. And I always admired him for that. There was no BS in him. Mel Shapiro was a good friend who helped me at the beginning of my career. He's the one who talked to me about getting involved with ASGE, trying to get on a committee to, again, not because I had an agenda to go to a certain level or get to a certain level, is because I thought that the things that that ASGE was doing and were working on was stuff that I wanted to see happen, and to do what I could to help along the way in getting those things accomplished. And he was a mentor to me, both in terms of my practice, my work at UCLA, and then in private practice, and very much so with regard to the ASGE and getting involved with that. Once I got involved with ASGE, as I moved up the committee structure ladder and became a counselor and all of that stuff, Bill Maloney, who was the executive director of ASGE, became a good friend and close ally. He was unfortunately passed away just recently, and he really helped not just me, but everyone who ever worked with him along the way in learning how to be politically correct, again, be fair to the people you work with, be straightforward, be honest, and know how to respond and deal with adversity and so forth. And those just human nature um, aspects of being involved in a society. He was a great mentor, and not just to me, but to everyone that ever worked with him.
Absolutely, and I think I've heard those both of those names repeated over and over by a lot of people that they've left a profound impact with at the ASGE. Um,
And,
in 1994 to 1995, during your ASGE presidency, I believe the presidential address that was given, the topic was endoscopy yesterday, today, and tomorrow. This is a topic that could still be presented on even today. Tell us a little bit about your address. In
well,
95, when you were presidency, what was considered to be yesterday, today, and tomorrow? And
well,
what would you think about it today?
it was an opportunity to look back initially as to where we started with this technology and how primitive we were. Just being able to look inside the gut reliably and easily was a tremendous step forward. I mean, traditionally, gastroenterology, as most medicine at the time, was based upon cognitive uh, processes. Uh, Patients who had certain set of symptoms or certain number of physical findings or some lab tests that were abnormal. And that was it. Short of an operation, you could certainly figure out at times what was going on in somebody's gut with laparotomy, but of course that was not a good answer. Um, and the ability to, for the first time, reliably and repeatedly and safely look at the organs that we were trying to make work or correct deficiencies in um, came about when we started doing endoscopy. And when you look back at what we did for things such as jaundice or um, dysphagia or polyps, the follow up. I mean, there was a it's hard to imagine now, but if you think about what we did when we had a patient who had a barium enema for either symptoms or for family history of colon cancer or something like that, if we found a polyp on the barium enema, if it was larger than a centimeter in diameter, they went to the OR and they had a small resection. If it was smaller than a centimeter, we watched it and repeated the barium enema a year later. And this was how GI was practiced. And I vividly remember while I was a resident at Penn, having Bill Raffensperger, who was a superb gastroenterologist, superb clinician, had the biggest practice in the University of Pennsylvania area. And he gave us a lecture on how do you manage polyps. And just what I said, you want follow them for until they're a centimeter and then take them out. Look where we are today, and it's a little different. And so yesterday was different. Today, at the time of the lecture, was substantially better, but we're nowhere close to being near where we were going. And we still have lots to go in order to fulfill all of the potential that we have. And I think the thing that's going to be the most dramatic is going to be the ability to basically work with two hands. If you think about what we do, it's really a catheter, another device on a catheter, another device on a catheter, another device. and we like one arm paper hanger or painter.
Right. Right.
Um, we are going to develop. We are now already developing means by which we can work triangularly, just like you do with laparoscopy, and be able to work intraluminally, extraluminally, one or the other or both, and be able to approach something in such a way as to cut and grasp, cut and sew, cut and remove or ablate, or what have you, and hold it in place and cut. I mean, there are lots of things that we're really just starting to develop. And if you look at the amount of procedures we now do, sleeve gastrectomy. I mean, it's incredible that we're doing the things that the surgeons used to do with an endoscope, and we will continue to do that, and we'll do it even better when we're able to use two hands rather than just one hand.
Absolutely. And I think that's it's it's um it's always very interesting to think about where we are today and think about how far we've come and where we're still planning to go with endoscopy. And I think, take a page out of your book. It really has to do with, keeping an open mind, surrounding yourself with people who are intelligent, doing the things that you find worthwhile, doing what interests you. And I think one of the first things that you had told us, when we planned this interview was need is really the mother of innovation as well, and understanding the need in endoscopy, having strong fundamentals in gastroenterology and in medicine as well. Any final thoughts? Anything? Any closing thoughts?
And the other thing that I think we need to pay more and more attention to are the developments in other fields that we didn't initially
Yes.
think would have anything to do with endoscopy. But if you think about artificial intelligence,
Right.
narrowband and imaging, things of that nature, I mean, it's it's not inconceivable that you're going to have a non-physician uh, put a scope in something, and everything is done automatically thereafter. The thing is advanced. The device is used, and the artificial intelligence, the coloration that you see, all of that may dramatically be done without you even in the room. I mean, it's incredible when you think about what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think the future is bright for endoscopy. I think you probably felt this way back in the 70s when you were training, right? That the future was going to be bright in endoscopy.
Absolutely. I mean, the development of the techniques that we now take for granted were giant steps forward with tremendous leaps. But the same chasm exists now. We can jump over, and
Right.
we can make that jump. And it's incredible to think about what we're doing now compared to what we were doing 10 years ago. I mean, let alone 40. 40 years is a
Right.
long
40
time.
years. 40
Yeah,
years of the Roth Net, Dr. Roth.
right.
So thank you again for
Thank
uh,
you.
for for the interview and for really your contributions to the field and for being such a phenomenal mentor to myself and to all the rest of us. I look forward to seeing this issue in print. I look forward to seeing the video interview that comes with it. Uh, Thank you again, Dr. Roth.
Thank you very much, Phil, for all of your hard work and your interest in doing this.
Absolutely. Thank
Thank
you.
you.